The job was simple enough: haul a load of steel pipes from Phoenix to Denver. A straight, uneventful road I'd driven dozens of times before, but this time I decided to take a different road. A shortcut I'd heard about from a guy at the truck stop, Route 71, a stretch of highway that ran through the heart of the desert. Fewer cars, less traffic, and supposedly it shaved an hour or two off the trip. Sounded good to me. It was nearing midnight when I merged onto Route 71, leaving the comfort of the interstate behind. The road was quiet, as expected, not a soul in sight. Just me, my rig, and the dark, open desert. The moon was low, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. The stars, bright and numerous, hung like shards of ice in the black sky. I've always liked night driving. Fewer distractions, less hassle. The steady hum of the engine was almost hypnotic, and for a while I lost myself in the rhythm of the road. But after a couple of hours, something felt off. I can't explain it really, but it was like the air had changed, thicker, heavier, and there was this smell like burnt rubber mixed with something metallic, like blood. I glanced down at the dashboard. Everything seemed normal, no warning lights, no signs of trouble. Still, the smell persisted, faint but there, creeping through the vents. I rolled down the window to get some fresh air, but it didn't help. The smell was outside too, stronger now, like it was clinging to the desert itself. I told myself it was nothing, just the heat playing tricks on me, maybe something burning off in the distance, unseen in the vastness of the desert. But the road felt wrong. The dark was closing in, thicker than it should have been. The headlights barely seemed to pierce through it. That's when I saw it, a figure, standing on the side of the road, illuminated briefly in my headlights. My heart skipped a beat, and my foot instinctively hit the brake. The rig slowed as I squinted through the windshield. It was a man, no. It was something shaped like a man. He was standing perfectly still, right at the edge of the road, just outside the reach of my lights. I slowed even more, debating whether or not to stop. My first thought was maybe he was broken down, lost in the middle of nowhere. Maybe he needed help. But there were no cars around, no sign of any vehicle, and he was standing so still it was unnerving. No waving, no movement, just standing. As I got closer, I could make out his silhouette more clearly. He was tall, lanky, and dressed in something dark, maybe black. His head was bowed, like he was staring at the ground, or maybe at his own feet. I leaned forward, trying to get a better look, but as I passed him, he didn't turn, didn't lift his head. Just kept standing there, motionless. The air inside the cab grew colder, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up as a wave of unease washed over me. I checked my mirrors, but the figure was gone. Just darkness in every direction. My heart was pounding, and I had to remind myself to breathe. It was probably just some drifter, maybe a hitchhiker too far gone to even flag me down. But why was he out there in the middle of the desert, in the dead of night? I tried to shake it off, but the air felt heavier now, colder, even with the desert heat still hanging in the night. That smell, burnt rubber and metal, was stronger, like it was clinging to the truck itself. About 20 minutes later, the road ahead was swallowed by fog. Thick, unnatural fog, the kind that shouldn't exist in the desert. My headlights barely cut through it, and the shadows it cast seemed to move in ways they shouldn't. I slowed down to a crawl, gripping the wheel tightly. Then, through the haze, I saw him again. The same figure, standing just off the road, exactly where he'd been before. My blood ran cold. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me. No one could move that fast, especially on foot. I passed him again, and just like before, he didn't move. Didn't acknowledge me. His head stayed bowed, and his arms hung limp at his sides. The fog swallowed him up as soon as I passed, and I felt my stomach twist in knots. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting him to vanish like before, but this time he didn't. He was following me. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, the fog playing with my mind. But no, he was there, moving toward me, fast, faster than anything human should. His legs didn't seem to move right. They were too long, stretching unnaturally as he sped toward the truck. I slammed my foot on the gas, the engine roaring to life, but he was still there, gaining on me. I looked away from the mirror, focusing on the road ahead, my heart hammering in my chest. The fog was thick, swirling around the truck like it had a mind of its own. The smell of burnt rubber was suffocating now, like the whole truck was on fire, though the temperature gauge read normal. I sped up, desperate to put distance between me and whatever that thing was. But every time I dared to glance in the rear view, he was there, closer. His head still bowed, his body moving in that same unnatural way. I don't know how long I drove like that. Time seemed to warp, stretch. The fog was endless, and the desert felt like it was swallowing me whole. I pushed the truck to its limits, the engine growling as the tires gripped the lonely, narrow highway. Suddenly the fog thinned, and the road opened up ahead. The dark, oppressive desert gave way to the faint lights of a distant gas station, a beacon in the night. I kept my foot on the gas, heading straight for it. The moment I pulled into the lot, the truck screeched to a halt. I jumped out, my legs trembling beneath me, and ran toward the small building, my breath ragged. The cashier, a young kid who couldn't have been older than 20, looked up from his phone as I burst through the door, wide-eyed and gasping for air. "You okay, man?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. I didn't answer, just stumbled toward the counter, glancing back through the windows. The fog was gone. The figure was gone. Nothing but the empty road stretched behind me. I leaned against the counter, trying to steady my breathing. Did you see him?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "See who?" The kid looked genuinely confused. I pointed toward the highway. "A man, out there by the road. I saw him twice. He was following me." The cashier frowned and shook his head. "You're the only person I've seen all night." I stared at him, feeling a cold knot of dread tighten in my chest. "There was a man," I insisted. "I passed him, and then he was behind me, chasing the truck." The kid gave me a sympathetic look, like he thought I was losing it. "It's just the desert, man. Plays tricks on you. People say this stretch of road is haunted or some crap like that. I wouldn't worry about it." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe it was just exhaustion, or the heat messing with my mind. But the smell of burnt rubber and metal still clung to me, like it had seeped into my clothes, into my skin. I didn't stay long at the gas station, just long enough to get my nerves back in check and fill up the tank. I didn't see the figure again on the rest of my drive, but the memory of him stayed with me. To this day, I don't take Route 71. And I've never been able to shake the feeling that something out there in the desert is waiting, watching, just waiting for the next trucker to pass by, alone in the dead of night. It was just after midnight when I pulled into the rest stop. I'd been driving for hours, trying to make up time on a delivery from Nevada to Utah. I was exhausted, the kind of tired that makes your eyelids feel like lead, and the dark, empty highway didn't help. My truck's headlights were the only thing cutting through the night. I needed to rest, even if it was just for a few minutes. The rest stop was small, one of those no-name places you only see if you're paying attention. A single flickering light in the parking lot and a rundown bathroom were all that greeted me. No other cars, no other trucks, just me, the highway, and the quiet that stretched too far. I parked the rig at the far end of the lot, as was habit, and killed the engine. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the wind whipping around outside. There wasn't even the usual hum of distant traffic. I leaned back in the seat, figuring I'd close my eyes for a few minutes before heading back out. Just a quick break. But something felt off. The kind of off that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, even when you can't explain why. I glanced around the cab, the dashboard lights casting a dim glow over the interior. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Parking lot was empty though. No cars had pulled in after me, and the only thing moving was the occasional gust of wind. Still, I couldn't relax. It felt like there were eyes on me, watching me from somewhere in the dark. I shook it off. Fatigue does weird things to your mind, and I'd been driving long enough to know how easy it was to start seeing things when you were dead tired. I needed sleep, but I also needed to get this load to Salt Lake by morning. I reached for my thermos, figuring a hit of coffee would help. That's when I saw it, a figure standing in the bathroom doorway, illuminated by the flickering light above the entrance. At first, I thought it was just another traveler, maybe some hitchhiker stopping for a break, but there was something wrong about how they stood there, motionless, staring straight at my truck, even though I couldn't see their face clearly. The figure didn't move, didn't come closer, didn't walk into the bathroom, just stood there as if waiting. I stared back, my hand frozen on the thermos. My breath felt caught in my throat. "It's nothing," I muttered to myself, trying to rationalize the situation. Maybe it was just another trucker, messing with me, or someone lost in thought, taking a break like I was. But they didn't move, not an inch. I rolled down the window slightly, just enough to shout. "You need something?" No answer. No sound at all. The figure stayed where they were, like a shadow glued to the doorway. The silence felt suffocating. I couldn't even hear the wind anymore. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, but I hesitated. Maybe they were in trouble, lost, hurt. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out of the truck, the cold night air biting at my skin. I kept my eyes on the figure as I crossed the parking lot, my boots crunching on the gravel. "Hey!" I called out again, but the figure still didn't respond. The closer I got, the more details I could make out. They were wearing what looked like old, tattered clothing, ripped jeans, and a jacket that had seen better days. Something about their posture, though, made my skin crawl. It was too rigid, too unnatural. I stopped about 10 feet away, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the dark. "You all right?" I asked, my voice steady, but my gut twisted in knots. That's when they moved. Not forward, but sideways. Like they were sliding rather than walking, their feet never leaving the ground. And the closer they got to the edge of the light, the clearer their face became. My stomach turned as I realized there was no face, just a smooth blank space where features should have been. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet as my heart hammered in my chest. The figure stopped at the edge of the light, its featureless face tilted as if it were watching me, even though there were no eyes. I scrambled to my feet and bolted back to the truck, my mind racing. What the hell was that? I slammed the door behind me, locking it and starting the engine in one frantic motion. The headlights flicked on, and I looked back toward the bathroom. The figure was gone. I sat there for a moment, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep them on the wheel. I threw the truck into gear and peeled out of the parking lot, tires kicking up gravel behind me. As I sped down the highway, I glanced in the rearview mirror. There it was again, standing in the middle of the road, growing smaller as I put distance between us. Just standing, watching, until it disappeared into the darkness. I didn't stop again until I hit the state line, and I've never taken that route again. I've been a trucker for over 20 years, and I've seen a lot of strange things out on the road. The long, empty highways can mess with your head fatigue, isolation, the dark stretching out for miles ahead. You get used to it after a while. But some things stick with you, no matter how much you try to forget. This is one of those stories. It was a typical run, hauling a load of canned goods from Dallas to a small town in Colorado. I'd taken this route a dozen times before, always the same long, uneventful stretches of desert highway, quiet, almost peaceful in a way. That night, I was running late, trying to make up time after getting stuck in traffic back in Amarillo. I'd planned to pull into a rest stop around midnight, but I decided to push on for another hour or two. The highway was completely empty, just me, the truck, and the dark road ahead. The moon was hidden behind a layer of clouds, and the only light came from my headlights, cutting through the night. Everything seemed normal, at least for the first few hours. Around 1 a.m., I passed mile marker 217. Nothing unusual about it, a faded green sign, probably hadn't been replaced in decades. But right after I passed it, something changed. The air in the cab felt colder, and not in the way you'd expect from the night air. It was a deep, bone-chilling cold, like I'd stepped into a freezer. I glanced at the temperature gauge, everything was normal. Heater was working fine, no reason for it. I brushed it off as just another strange quirk of night driving. Maybe the wind had picked up, or I was just tired. I cranked the heater a bit and kept driving. Then I saw him. Standing on the side of the road, just a little ways past the mile marker, was a man. At first I thought he was hitchhiking, an old man, maybe in his late 60s, wearing a long coat and a hat. He was waving his arm slowly, like he needed a ride. But there was something about the way he stood that unsettled me. His posture was stiff, rigid, like he was frozen in place. I passed him without stopping, just giving a quick glance as I drove by. In this line of work, you learn not to pick up hitchhikers. Too many horror stories, too many risks. Still, I felt bad. He was out in the middle of nowhere, on a road where I hadn't seen another vehicle in over an hour. A few miles later, that cold feeling crept back into the cab, stronger this time. It was like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in an instant. I checked the heater again, still working fine, but the cold was so intense I could see my breath fogging up in front of me. That's when I saw him again. The same old man, standing on the side of the road, just a few yards ahead. He was in the exact same position, waving his arm the same slow, deliberate way. My heart skipped a beat. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me, no way he could have moved that fast. I hadn't passed any cars, and there were no side roads, no exits, nothing but open desert for miles. I kept driving, refusing to look directly at him as I passed, but I could feel his eyes on me, even though I hadn't seen his face clearly. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, and I pressed the gas a little harder, trying to shake the growing sense of dread creeping up my spine. Another few miles down the road, and the cold became unbearable. I could barely hold the steering wheel, my fingers numb and stiff. The air felt thick, oppressive, and my breath came out in shaky, visible puffs. I turned the heater to full blast, but it didn't make a difference. And then I saw him again. This time, he was standing directly in the middle of the road, illuminated by my headlights. The same old man, wearing the same long coat and hat, his arm still raised as if asking for a ride. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. The truck screeched to a halt just a few feet from him, the tires kicking up dust. But he didn't move, didn't flinch. He just stood there, staring at me, his eyes shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. I couldn't see his face clearly, but I could feel his gaze, cold and piercing. For a moment, I just sat there, frozen in place, staring back at him. The truck's engine idled, the only sound in the suffocating silence of the desert. I didn't know what to do. Should I get out? Should I try to drive around him? Before I could make a decision, he stepped toward the truck. Slowly, deliberately, his movements unnaturally smooth. My hand instinctively went to the door lock, but it was already engaged. Still, I didn't feel safe. As he got closer, the cold intensified. I could feel it seeping through the windows, through the metal of the cab, as if it was radiating from him. My heart raced, and I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. He stopped right at the edge of the headlights, his face still hidden in shadow. And then, without warning, he disappeared. Not walked away, disappeared. Like he'd never been there. The road was empty. The desert was silent. And the cold, it vanished just like that, leaving me sitting in the cab, drenched in sweat, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't wait. I threw the truck into gear and floored it, the engine roaring as I sped down the highway. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I just drove, heart hammering in my chest, until I saw the faint glow of the next town on the horizon. I pulled into a truck stop, parked the rig, and sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I'd heard stories before, legends of ghost hitchhikers, phantom figures on deserted roads, but I'd never believed them. Not until now. The next day, I asked around, trying to see if anyone else had experienced something similar on Route 71. A few old-timers nodded knowingly when I mentioned mile marker 217. One of them, a grizzled veteran with more miles under his belt than I'd ever seen, leaned in close and said, "You saw the phantom, didn't you?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know. I've never taken Route 71 since that night, and I never will. It was a cold November night, and I was hauling a load through the desolate back roads of West Virginia. My route took me along Route 16, a long winding highway that cut through the Appalachian Mountains. It wasn't the fastest way, but it was the only road that would get me to my drop-off point on time. I'd heard stories about these parts, of strange sightings and disappearances, but I never put much stock in them. I'd been driving trucks for over 15 years, and in all that time, nothing had scared me off the road until that night. I was about 3 hours into my drive when I noticed the first sign of trouble. My headlights flickered, just for a second, but enough to catch my attention. I glanced at the dashboard, but everything looked normal. Still, the flicker left me on edge. There was no one else on the road, no other headlights in the distance, just me and the dark stretch of highway ahead. The trees pressed in on either side of the road, their twisted branches casting long, jagged shadows that danced in the edges of my vision. The night was eerily still, no wind, no sound except for the hum of the engine and the tires on the pavement. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a large dog. It darted across the road up ahead, just beyond the reach of my headlights. I slowed down, not wanting to hit whatever it was, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't an animal at all. It was a figure standing in the middle of the road, a woman. She was dressed in white, her long pale hair hanging loose around her shoulders. Her back was to me, and she wasn't moving, just standing there, as still as a statue. My heart skipped a beat. There was no way anyone could have gotten out here on foot. There weren't any towns for miles. I brought the truck to a stop, my hands gripping the wheel as I stared at her. She didn't turn around, didn't move, just stood there, like she was waiting for something. "Hey," I shouted out the window, trying to get her attention. "You all right?" No response. I felt a chill creep up my spine. Something about her wasn't right. I couldn't explain it, but every instinct I had was screaming at me to get out of there. I honked the horn, but she didn't even flinch, just kept standing there, her back to me, the white fabric of her dress almost glowing in the dim light of my headlights. I didn't want to get out of the truck, but I couldn't just leave her there. Maybe she was hurt, or maybe she was lost. With a heavy sigh, I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door. The moment my foot hit the ground, I felt it. The temperature had dropped sharply. The air was so cold it felt like winter had come early. My breath puffed out in white clouds and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I took a few steps toward the woman, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Ma'am, do you need help?" I called out, my voice shaky despite my best efforts to stay calm. She didn't answer. I was only about 10 feet away from her now, close enough to see that her feet were bare, and her skin was pale, almost translucent in the cold light. My gut twisted in knots. Something was very wrong here. And then, slowly, she turned around. Her face, it was twisted, contorted in a way that no human face should be. Her mouth hung open in a silent scream, her eyes wide and hollow, black as the night around us. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, neither of us moved. It was like the world had stopped. Then she lunged at me. I stumbled back, barely catching myself as I scrambled toward the truck. My heart was pounding in my chest, adrenaline surging through my veins. I could hear her behind me, her footsteps unnaturally fast, like she was gliding across the ground. I didn't dare look back. I threw myself into the cab and slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. My breath came in ragged gasps as I fumbled to put the truck into gear. The woman was at the window now, her twisted face pressed against the glass, her eyes boring into mine. Her mouth was moving, but no sound came out, just the eerie sight of her lips forming words I couldn't understand. I floored the gas pedal, the truck roared to life, and I tore down the highway, not daring to slow down or look in the mirrors. My heart raced, and my hands gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I drove like a madman, the road blurring beneath me as I sped through the night. After what felt like an eternity, I finally glanced in the rearview mirror. She was gone. The road was empty behind me, just as it had been before. No sign of the woman, no sign that anything had ever been there. But the cold hadn't left. It clung to me, wrapping around my skin like a blanket of frost. My breath still fogged the air, and the eerie sense of being watched lingered, even though I was miles away from where I'd seen her. I didn't stop until I reached the next truck stop, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, somewhere, waiting. I asked around at the diner, hoping someone might know something, but the locals were tight-lipped. One old man sitting alone at the counter gave me a knowing look. "You saw her, didn't you?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't respond, but he didn't need me to. "They say she's been wandering these roads for years, died in a car wreck back in the 70s, right around mile marker 112. She's still looking for her family, they say, still looking for a ride home." I left that truck stop and never took Route 16 again. It was the kind of night truckers dread, black as pitch, with no moon and no stars. I was on a long-haul run from Oregon to Idaho carrying a load of refrigerated goods. The highway stretched endlessly before me, with nothing but the hum of my rig and the occasional signpost whipping past in the darkness. I had taken a shortcut through a little used stretch of road, one that wasn't even marked on most maps. It cut several hours off the trip, or so I'd been told by a fellow trucker. But as the miles crept on, I began to wonder if I'd made a mistake. No other vehicles, no roadside lights, just an oppressive darkness pressing in on all sides. I wasn't the superstitious type, but something about that road felt wrong. The further I drove, the heavier the air seemed to get. It was like the night itself was closing in, wrapping its fingers around my truck. The GPS had lost signal an hour ago, and I was relying purely on my gut and a vague memory of the route. Around midnight, the fog started rolling in. It came out of nowhere, thick and swirling, swallowing up the road ahead until I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. I slowed down to a crawl, my eyes straining against the fog, trying to catch glimpses of the faded yellow lines on the road. That's when I saw a figure standing on the shoulder of the highway, barely visible through the mist. At first I thought it was just another hitchhiker, but as I got closer, I realized something was off. The person was standing stock still, facing away from the road, their back toward me. They didn't move a muscle, didn't even flinch as my truck roared past. I could only make out the outline of a long coat, the hood pulled up over their head, obscuring their face. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Hitchhikers were common, sure, but this one, they weren't even trying to wave me down. Just standing there, like a statue, as if they'd been waiting for something or someone. I pushed the thought from my mind and focused on the road ahead. I was tired, and my mind was probably playing tricks on me. Just keep driving, I told myself. There was no reason to get worked up over something so small. About 10 minutes later, the fog thickened even more. I could barely see a few feet in front of the truck. I slowed to a near stop, inching my way forward. As I peered through the windshield, I caught sight of something up ahead again. It was the same figure. I swear to God, it was the exact same person, standing in the same spot, facing away, unmoving. My stomach churned as a cold wave of fear washed over me. This wasn't possible. There were no turnoffs, no crossroads, just a single straight road. There was no way they could have gotten ahead of me. I hadn't even seen another vehicle in hours. I gripped the wheel tightly, forcing myself to keep moving. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe there were two hitchhikers out here, dressed the same, behaving the same. It didn't make sense, but it was better than thinking about the alternative. Another 5 minutes passed, and the fog seemed to close in tighter, the darkness pressing against my windows like a living thing. I had to focus every ounce of attention on the road to avoid running off it, but my mind kept drifting back to that figure. And then, there they were again, standing in the middle of the road this time, directly in my path. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching as the truck came to a halt. My heart was hammering in my chest as I stared at the figure, standing motionless in my headlights. They didn't react to the sound of my truck skidding or the bright lights shining on them. They just stood there, with their back to me, as if they hadn't even noticed me barreling toward them. I was frozen for a moment, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly, they ached. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct was screaming at me to turn around, to get the hell out of there. But I couldn't just sit there in the middle of the road. I reached for the horn, pressing it down hard. The blaring sound echoed into the fog, but the figure didn't budge. "Hey!" I shouted, leaning out the window. "Get out of the road." Nothing, not even a twitch. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. My truck was still idling, the engine rumbling quietly beneath me. Slowly I shifted it into reverse, my eyes never leaving the figure. I backed up a few feet, my hands trembling on the gear shift. Suddenly the figure moved. They turned, slowly, almost mechanically, until they were facing me. My breath caught in my throat. The hood was still up, casting a shadow over their face, but there was something wrong about the way they stood. Their limbs seemed too long, their posture unnatural. It was like they didn't belong in that body. Then, without warning, they started walking toward the truck. I panicked. I threw the truck into drive and floored it, swerving around the figure. My heart was pounding in my chest as I sped down the road, the fog swallowing me up again. I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see the figure shrinking in the distance. But there was nothing there. I didn't stop until I reached a truck stop on the outskirts of the next town, my hands still shaking as I pulled into the parking lot. I stumbled out of the cab, gasping for air, trying to shake the lingering terror that clung to me. To this day, I don't know what I saw out there on that highway, but I've never taken that shortcut again, and I'll never forget that figure standing there in the fog, waiting for something or someone. I've been driving trucks for nearly 2 decades, hauling everything from produce to heavy machinery across every stretch of highway this country has to offer. You get used to the long hours, the late-night stops, and the solitude. But no amount of experience could prepare me for what happened one cold October night in 2015. I had just picked up a load from Salt Lake City, heading toward the Midwest. The weather report had called for clear skies, but the moment I hit the open road, dark clouds began gathering. It wasn't long before a light drizzle turned into a full-blown storm. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel as the rain lashed against the windshield, making visibility near impossible. I had planned on making it to Cheyenne before stopping for the night, but with the storm worsening, I decided to pull off at the next rest stop. As luck would have it, I saw a sign for a small truck stop about 10 miles up the road. Relieved, I turned on my blinker and eased onto the exit ramp, hoping to wait out the storm. The truck stop was small, just a couple of pumps and a tiny diner attached to it. The neon open 24 hours sign flickered faintly in the rain. I pulled into one of the parking spots, shut off the engine, and leaned back in my seat. I was tired but hungry. Figuring a hot cup of coffee and a sandwich would do me some good, I grabbed my jacket and stepped out of the truck. The moment I did, something felt off. It wasn't the kind of off that comes from being tired or road weary. It was deeper, almost primal. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and a strange sensation washed over me like I was being watched. I shook it off, blaming it on exhaustion and the eerie atmosphere of the storm, and made my way inside. The diner was mostly empty, save for an old woman sitting in the corner with a cup of tea. The place smelled of old grease and stale coffee. I took a seat at the counter and waited for someone to come out from the back. After a minute or two, a middle-aged waitress appeared. She didn't say much, just handed me a menu and walked away. The silence in the place was almost oppressive, broken only by the sound of rain pounding against the windows. As I waited for my food, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I looked over at the woman in the corner, and she was staring right at me. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, like she was trying to communicate something without speaking. I felt a chill run down my spine. "Excuse me," I called out to the waitress, but she didn't acknowledge me. I looked back at the old woman, but she had turned her attention back to her cup of tea. Something wasn't right. I stood up, my appetite gone, and decided to head back to my truck. As I pushed open the door and stepped outside, I froze. My truck's headlights were on, which was odd because I was sure I had turned everything off before heading inside. I jogged over to it, the rain soaking through my jacket, and peered inside. There was someone sitting in the driver's seat. My heart raced as I yanked open the door, but the seat was empty. The cab was just as I had left it, save for one small detail. The seatbelt was fastened, like someone had been there and buckled themselves in. I climbed inside, locking the doors behind me, and sat there for a moment, trying to calm my nerves. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe I had just forgotten to turn off the lights or buckle the seatbelt. After all, it had been a long day. I started the engine, eager to leave the truck stop behind, but as I pulled back onto the highway, the feeling that I wasn't alone grew stronger. I adjusted the rearview mirror and caught a glimpse of something in the sleeper cab behind me. At first it looked like a shadow, a trick of the dim light. But then I saw it move. A figure tall and gaunt was hunched over in the back, its head bent at an unnatural angle, staring directly at me. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt on the rain-slicked road. My heart was pounding in my chest as I twisted around in my seat. The sleeper cab was empty. I mustered the courage to get out and check the back, but there was nothing there. No signs of anyone, no footprints, nothing. Just the sound of rain and my own shaky breathing. I got back in the truck and floored it, driving through the night, ignoring every stop, every sign of fatigue. I didn't stop until I reached Cheyenne the next morning, never gone back to that truck stop, and to this day I don't know what I saw. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or maybe the storm had messed with my head, but every time I think about it, I can still feel those eyes watching me from the dark. It was supposed to be a quick job. Pick up the load from Reno, drive it down to Phoenix, and be done with it by the next afternoon. Easy money, and I needed it. The haul was nothing special, just some construction materials packed into a shipping container. I'd done hundreds of trips like this one before, but that night turned into something I'll never forget. I left Reno around 10 p.m., hoping to beat the worst of the traffic and make good time. The weather was clear, the roads were dry, and I had a thermos full of hot coffee to keep me company. There's something calming about driving through the desert at night, the vast emptiness stretching out on both sides of the highway, the stars dotting the sky like a sea of tiny lights. A few hours into the drive, around 2 a.m., I noticed something strange. The radio had gone silent, not just static, but completely dead, like someone had flipped a switch and turned off the entire world. I fiddled with the dial, but nothing worked. No music, no talk shows, not even the emergency broadcast channel. Just silence. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just a dead zone, and continued driving. That's when I saw it headlights in the distance, coming up fast behind me. At first, I was relieved. It's rare to see another vehicle out there in the middle of the night, and it was comforting to know I wasn't entirely alone. But as the car approached, something felt off. The headlights were bright, blinding almost, but there was no sound. No engine noise, no tires on the asphalt, just those lights bearing down on me like two burning eyes in the dark. The car pulled up beside me, and I caught a glimpse of it out of the corner of my eye. It was an old black sedan, the kind you'd see in movies from the 1960s. Its windows were tinted so dark that I couldn't see who was inside, but I could feel the presence of someone or something watching me. For a few minutes, the car matched my speed, cruising right beside me. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the road ahead, but my heart was racing. Then, without warning, the sedan swerved in front of my truck, cutting me off. I slammed on the brakes, my rig screeching to a halt, but the car didn't stop. It sped off into the distance, disappearing into the desert as quickly as it had appeared. I sat there, my hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm down. Maybe it was just some punk messing with me, I thought. But deep down, I knew there was something more to it, something wrong. I took a deep breath, started the engine again, and continued down the highway, my nerves still rattled. About 20 miles later, I saw another set of headlights in the distance, this time coming from the opposite direction. As the vehicle got closer, I noticed it was a truck, like mine. Relief washed over me, thinking I might be able to get some answers from a fellow driver. But when the truck passed by, I caught a glimpse of the driver. It was me. I slammed on the brakes again, the truck screeching to a stop in the middle of the highway. My hands were shaking as I stared at the road ahead, my mind reeling. That driver, the one in the other truck, was identical to me. Same face, same jacket, even the same damn truck. I sat there for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen, but the desert was silent, the highway empty, and there was no sign of the other truck. No tire marks, no taillights in the distance, just the endless stretch of blacktop and the vast, unforgiving night. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I couldn't stay there. I started driving again, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds, half expecting to see that black sedan or my doppelganger truck coming up behind me. But the road remained empty. About an hour later, I spotted a rest stop up ahead. It wasn't much, just a couple of gas pumps, a small convenience store, and a single truck parked in the lot, but I needed a break. I pulled in, shut off the engine, and sat there for a minute trying to gather myself. I got out and walked over to the store, but when I stepped inside, it was empty. Not just empty of people, but empty of everything. The shelves were bare, the lights flickering dimly overhead. It looked like no one had been there for years. I turned to leave, but the door wouldn't budge. Panic set in as I pulled and yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't move. I was trapped. Then I heard a faint hum, like static on an old TV, coming from behind the counter. I walked over, my heart pounding in my chest, and found an old radio sitting there. It was crackling with static, but as I got closer, a voice broke through. "Don't stop. Keep driving." I stumbled back, knocking over a display of dusty soda cans. The voice repeated, clearer this time. "Don't stop. Keep driving." I ran out of the store, the door suddenly giving way, and jumped back into my truck. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get out of there. I floored it, speeding down the highway, the rest stop vanishing in the rearview mirror. I didn't stop driving until the sun came up. By the time I reached Phoenix, I felt like I'd been awake for days. I made the delivery, but I've never taken a night job since. And I still hear that voice sometimes in the quiet moments on the road. Don't stop. Keep driving. It was one of those long hauls I'd taken 100 times before, Highway 89, slicing through the endless flatland with nothing but the occasional gas station and scattered truck stops for company. The sun had long since set, and the only light came from my headlights and the dull glow of the dashboard. The night was heavy, pressing down on the truck like a weight, making the miles stretch out longer than they should. I wasn't one to scare easily. After 20 years on the road, you get used to the loneliness and the dark. But there was something different about this night. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I was about 4 hours in when I noticed a flicker of movement in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was just the wind picking up dust off the highway. It was dry that time of year, and the wind could play tricks on your eyes. But when I glanced back again, I saw it more clearly, a figure standing in the middle of the road, far behind me, barely visible in the rearview mirror. A hitchhiker, maybe. But that didn't make sense. There hadn't been a town or exit for miles, no cars either. Just me in the dark, stretching out in every direction. I kept driving, chalking it up to fatigue or my imagination getting the better of me. But that uneasy feeling lingered. I couldn't get the image out of my head, the figure standing alone in the middle of nowhere. 10 minutes later, I saw them again. This time they were closer, standing at the edge of the highway, just barely illuminated by my headlights. I slowed the truck down, eyes narrowing to get a better look. It was a man, dressed in an old tattered coat. His hair was wild, hanging over his face like he'd been out there for a long time. He wasn't waving, wasn't signaling for help, he was just standing there, staring straight ahead. Something about him sent a chill up my spine. Normally, I would have stopped, maybe offered him a ride or at least checked if he was all right. But this time, I didn't. I don't know why. Instinct, maybe. There was something off about him. I pushed the truck back up to speed, my heart pounding a little harder than I'd like to admit. The dark swallowed him up as I sped past, and I forced myself to focus on the road ahead. 15 minutes later, he was back. This time, he was standing directly in the road, about 100 feet in front of me. There was no mistaking it, it was the same man. The truck's headlights caught his face for a brief second as I slammed on the brakes, and I swear to God he was smiling. Not the kind of smile you give when you're happy, but something else, something twisted. The tires squealed as the truck lurched to a stop just inches from where the man stood. I could feel my pulse in my throat. a cold sweat breaking out on my skin, but when I looked again, he was gone. The road was empty. The man had vanished, like he'd never been there in the first place. I sat there for a few seconds, my hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My heart was racing, my mind scrambling for some rational explanation. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe the long hours were catching up to me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I put the truck back into gear and kept going, a little faster than before, trying to shake off the unease crawling up my spine. The highway was still empty, the night pressing in around me. But now, every shadow felt like it was watching. Every gust of wind carried an edge of menace. And then, about 20 miles up the road, I saw it again. A figure, standing in the same place, in the same position. But this time, he was closer. Much closer. I swerved, instinctively yanking the wheel to the side as I veered off the road. The truck skidded to a stop on the shoulder, dust and gravel kicking up around me. My heart pounded in my ears, adrenaline surging through my veins. But when I looked back toward the road, the figure was gone. Again. I sat there for a long time, hands trembling on the wheel, trying to catch my breath. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I'd seen, but nothing made sense. There were no footprints, no sign of anyone. Just the empty highway stretching out in front of me, silent and still. I took a few deep breaths, trying to calm the pounding in my chest. I was done for the night. No way I was going to keep driving, not after what I'd just seen. I was too rattled, too shaken to focus on the road. I pulled off to the nearest truck stop, about another 5 miles up the road. I parked the rig and went inside, my legs feeling like jelly. I grabbed a cup of coffee and sat down at one of the tables, still trying to make sense of what had just happened. An old-timer sitting at the counter noticed me, gave me a nod. "Rough night?" he asked, his voice gruff but not unkind. I nodded, still trying to shake the eerie feeling that clung to me like a second skin. "Seen anything weird out on 89? I asked, not sure if I even wanted to hear the answer. The old-timer's face darkened, and he set his coffee down, eyes narrowing slightly. "You saw him, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low. My blood ran cold. "Heard a few stories over the years," he continued. "They say there's a man out there, shows up in the middle of the night always smiling. Folks say he's been out there for decades, ever since his truck broke down and he got stranded. They found his rig, but never found him. Only thing they found was that smile carved right into his face." I didn't say anything, just sat there in silence, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. "Best stay off 89 at night," the old-timer said, sipping his coffee like he'd said nothing out of the ordinary. It was around midnight, deep in the heart of Wyoming, and I was hauling a heavy load across one of those long stretches of highway, where nothing but stars and pitch-black desert surrounded you. I'd been on the road for nearly 12 hours straight, and though I'd guzzled down enough coffee to keep a small town awake, I was still battling the creeping exhaustion that threatened to pull me under. I had the radio on, but the static-filled chatter of distant truckers wasn't enough to keep the eerie silence of the road from seeping into my bones. I'd been down this stretch before, but something about the night felt different. It was darker, more desolate, like the world outside the truck had disappeared entirely. I checked the clock on the dashboard, 0:45 a.m. I was still about 2 hours from the next stop. I gripped the wheel, forcing myself to stay alert when something strange happened. Up ahead, I saw headlights, faint at first, but growing brighter. Finally, some company on this deserted road. As I got closer, I realized it wasn't just one vehicle. It was a convoy. 5, maybe 6 trucks, all in a neat line, their taillights glowing like beacons in the dark. I'd been driving this route long enough to know this wasn't normal. Convoys weren't uncommon, but this was different. The trucks were old, way too old to still be on the road. They looked like rigs from the 50s or 60s, the kind you see in vintage trucker calendars. Each one was painted a dull, faded black, the kind of color that looks more like a shadow than a proper paint job. I figured maybe it was some kind of classic truck parade or a bunch of enthusiasts heading to a meetup. Still, something didn't sit right with me. Why would a convoy of vintage trucks be out here in the middle of nowhere at this time of night? I shrugged it off and settled behind the convoy, maintaining a safe distance. Their lights were steady, and their speed was consistent, a little slower than I would have liked, but nothing to worry about. I figured I'd overtake them once we hit a passing lane. That's when things got strange. I noticed one of the trucks up ahead flicker just for a second, like it blinked out of existence and then reappeared. I blinked, thinking I'd imagined it, but then it happened again. This time the flicker lasted longer, and for a moment I could swear I saw the outline of the truck vanish completely, leaving nothing but the empty road in its place. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I gripped the wheel a little tighter. I flipped on my high beams trying to get a better look at the convoy, but the trucks ahead seemed unfazed by the sudden glare. No one signaled, no one slowed down. They just kept driving in that eerie, unbroken line. Then, without warning, the lead truck swerved violently to the right, its massive frame dipping into the shoulder as if something had run into the road. My heart jumped into my throat, and I instinctively hit the brakes, expecting a pile-up, but the truck corrected itself just as quickly as it had swerved. The rest of the convoy didn't react at all. No brake lights, no adjustments, nothing. I eased off the brakes, my pulse hammering in my ears. I debated radioing in to the truckers ahead, but something told me not to. Something deep and instinctual, a primal warning that screamed in my mind. Don't reach out. Don't let them know you're here. I decided to pass them. I waited for a straight stretch of road and eased into the left lane, pressing down on the gas. As I pulled up beside the convoy, I glanced over at the trucks. Up close, they were even more unsettling. The cabs were empty, no drivers. I blinked, certain I was seeing things, but no matter how many times I checked, each cab was the same, vacant. No one was at the wheel. The trucks were driving themselves, moving in perfect unison like some kind of ghostly caravan. I floored it. My rig groaned as I pushed it harder than I should have, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get the hell away from whatever was going on behind me. I passed the last truck in the convoy and didn't look back. My hands were sweating, my heart racing, but I felt a sense of relief as the empty road stretched out in front of me once again. And then, the worst thing happened. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw the convoy again right behind me. I'd left them in the dust just moments ago, but now they were back, closer than before, their headlights glaring in the darkness. My pulse spiked, and I pressed harder on the gas, but no matter how fast I went, the convoy stayed with me, their lights bearing down on me like glowing eyes in the dark. Panic set in. I flipped the radio on, hoping to hear anyone on the other end. Breaker, breaker, this is rig 249. Can anyone hear me? Over. Nothing but static. I tried again. Anyone out there, come in. Still nothing. The convoy was closing in now, their headlights growing brighter in the rearview mirror. I could feel the weight of them, like they were bearing down on me, surrounding me. And then, just as suddenly as they'd appeared, the lights vanished. I blinked, disoriented, my hands still white-knuckled on the wheel. I glanced in the rearview mirror again, but the road was empty. The trucks were gone, as if they had never been there at all. I didn't slow down for another 20 miles. When I finally pulled into a truck stop, I stumbled out of the cab, my legs shaking beneath me. I found a table at the diner and sat down, my mind racing. An older trucker sitting at the counter noticed me and wandered over. He took one look at my face and nodded. "You saw him, didn't you?" he asked quietly. I didn't respond at first, but my silence must have been answer enough. The old man sighed and slid into the seat across from me. "Happens on Route 16 every now and then," he said, his voice low. "Some folks say it's a phantom convoy, a group of drivers who disappeared in the 60s. Took a detour one night, trying to save some time, but they never made it to their destination. People say they've been out there ever since, driving that same stretch of highway, looking for a way home." I sat there in stunned silence as the old man got up and walked back to the counter. I never drove that route again. Some roads, I learned, are haunted by more than just the past. And some convoys, they never stop driving. The job had taken me farther than I intended. That night I was hauling a double trailer through the back roads of Montana, navigating a winding unlit highway that seemed to stretch endlessly into the dark I'd been driving for. Hours, and exhaustion was creeping in. Every time my eyes fluttered shut, I forced them open, reminding myself I still had another 2 hours to go before I could stop. It was a lonely road, no signs of civilization, no other cars. Just me and my rig barreling down the endless stretch of asphalt. I checked the clock, 1:13 a.m. My body screamed for a break, but there wasn't much of a choice out here. I had miles to go before the nearest truck stop. Then, as if some cosmic force answered my need, a sign appeared on the right-hand side of the road. It was rusted and barely legible, but I made out the words "Rest Stop, 1 mile." I let out a sigh of relief. Maybe it wasn't much, but it would give me a chance to stretch my legs and wake myself up. I slowed down and kept an eye out for the turnoff. A minute later, I spotted the exit, a narrow gravel path that led into the woods. It didn't look well maintained, but at this point, I didn't care. I needed to stop. I took the turn and followed the bumpy road deeper into the trees. The rest stop came into view soon after, a cracked concrete lot with a single flickering light pole. There was a small building, likely restrooms, and an old vending machine leaning against the side. The place looked abandoned, no other vehicles, no signs of anyone around, but it was better than nothing. I pulled my truck into the lot and parked near the edge, just in case anyone else showed up. I shut off the engine, and the silence was immediate and unnerving. The only sound was the soft hum of the wind through the trees. I stepped out of the cab, the cold air biting at my skin as I stretched my stiff muscles. The place felt wrong. There was no other way to describe it. The air was thick with something I couldn't quite put my finger on, like the forest was holding its breath. I shook it off and walked toward the restrooms, my boots crunching on the cracked pavement. The door to the men's room was hanging on its hinges, creaking as it swayed slightly in the wind. I pushed it open, and the smell hit me immediately, stale and musty, like the place hadn't been used in years. The inside wasn't much better. The tiles were cracked, and the mirrors were covered in a thick layer of grime. I used the facilities quickly, eager to get back to the truck. As I washed my hands, I caught a glimpse of something in the mirror, just a flash of movement behind me. I spun around, but the restroom was empty. The door creaked again, but there was no one there. Must be tired, I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the feeling of unease creeping up my spine. I left the building and headed back to my truck. As I approached, I noticed something strange. There was a figure standing by the vending machine, half hidden in the shadows. It was a man, tall and thin, his back turned to me. I hadn't seen him when I arrived, and the way he stood there, so still, made my skin crawl. "Hey buddy," I called out, trying to sound casual. "You all right?" He didn't respond, didn't move. I took a step closer, my instincts screaming at me to get back in the truck and leave, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hey," I said again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. I hesitated, then stepped around to get a better look at him. His clothes were old tattered jeans, a plaid shirt, and a trucker hat that looked like it had seen better days. His skin was pale, almost gray, and when I finally got a look at his face, I froze. His eyes were wide open, but they were glassy and vacant, like he wasn't really there. His mouth was hanging open in a silent scream, frozen in place as if he'd been caught mid-shout, and then I realized he wasn't breathing. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The man wasn't alive. But how had I not noticed him before? He had been standing right there the whole time, hadn't he? I bolted back to my truck, my hands shaking as I fumbled to get the door open. As soon as I was inside, I locked the doors and started the engine. The headlights flickered on, illuminating the lot in front of me, and the man was gone. I blinked, my mind racing. He had been standing there, right by the vending machine. I couldn't have imagined it. But now, the spot where he'd stood was empty, the shadows undisturbed. I didn't waste any more time. I shifted into gear and pulled out of the lot, the gravel crunching under the tires as I sped back onto the highway. My heart was still pounding, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see that man or whatever he was standing in the middle of the road behind me. As the miles passed, I forced myself to calm down. Maybe it was just exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. After all, I'd been on the road for hours. But deep down, I knew what I saw. That man, he wasn't a hallucination. I drove for about another hour before I spotted lights up ahead, a proper truck stop. I pulled in and parked, relieved to see other trucks lining the lot. I climbed out and headed into the diner, my legs still shaky from what I'd just experienced. I sat down at the counter and ordered a coffee, desperate for something to steady my nerves. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with a tired smile, poured me a cup and set it in front of me. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said with a chuckle. I forced a smile, but didn't respond. After a few minutes, I couldn't hold it in anymore. "You ever heard of a rest stop back down Route 23? About 20 miles west of here?" Her smile faltered, and she glanced at the truckers sitting at the far end of the counter. "You stopped there?" I nodded, taking a sip of the hot coffee. "Yeah, something weird happened. There was a guy there, standing by the vending machine, but when I got back to my truck, he was gone." The waitress exchanged a glance with one of the older truckers, and he shook his head. "That rest stop's been closed for over 30 years, she said quietly. "They shut it down after a trucker was found dead there back in the 70s. No one ever figured out what happened to him. Some say he had a heart attack, but others, they say it wasn't natural. They say he still haunts that place." I stared at her, my blood running cold. "I wouldn't stop there again if I were you," the trucker at the end of the counter added, his voice low. "Not if you want to make it through the night." I didn't need to be told twice. From that moment on, I avoided Route 23 like the plague. Because I knew, Whatever I had seen that night, it wasn't just a ghost story, it was a warning. It was a routine run, hauling a load of auto parts from Dallas to Denver, something I'd done more times than I could count. It was mid-October, and the air had that crisp bite to it that made long drives feel almost refreshing. I'd left Dallas around noon, figuring I'd stop somewhere near Amarillo for the night before pushing through the next day. By the time dusk rolled around, I was in the middle of nowhere. The highway was nearly empty, just me, the open road, and the faint orange glow of the setting sun. There's a certain kind of peace that comes with driving at night when the world gets quiet, and all you've got is the hum of the engine to keep you company. But that night, peace was the last thing I'd find. I was about 30 miles outside of Amarillo when I saw him. A man standing on the side of the road, his thumb outstretched. Normally, I wouldn't think twice about picking up a hitchhiker, especially at night. Too many crazies out there. But something about this guy seemed different. He didn't look like the usual wanderers you see on the highway. He was dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned suit, the kind you'd see in black and white photos. His hair was slicked back, and he was just standing there, perfectly still. As I got closer, I could see his eyes locked onto my truck, following it as I approached. Against my better judgment, I slowed down. Maybe it was the suit, or the fact that he didn't look disheveled like most hitchhikers. Or maybe it was just the eerie emptiness of the highway that made me feel like I should stop. I pulled over and rolled down the window slightly. "Where you headed?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "Denver," he replied, his voice low and calm. Coincidence, I thought. "Well, I'm headed that way," I said, though my gut was already telling me this was a bad idea. "Hop in." He climbed into the passenger seat without another word, moving with a strange grace, almost too fluid. I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine and started driving again. For the first few miles, we sat in silence. I snuck a few glances at him, but he just stared straight ahead, his hands resting on his knees. There was something about him, something off. His skin was pale, too pale, and his eyes, they didn't seem to blink. I tried making small talk to cut the tension. "So, you from around here?" He turned his head slowly to face me. "No," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. I cleared my throat, gripping the wheel tighter. "What brings you to Denver?" Again that slow turn of his head. "Just passing through." Every word he said seemed to hang in the air, thick and cold. I could feel the temperature in the cab drop a few degrees, though I hadn't touched the air conditioning. My instinct screamed at me to pull over, let him out, and get the hell out of there, but something kept me from doing it. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was fear. After a long stretch of silence, he spoke again. "You ever pick up passengers before?" "Not usually," I admitted, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're lucky. I don't stop for just anyone." He chuckled a low, hollow sound that sent a chill down my spine. "Yes, I suppose I am." We drove in silence for another hour, the highway stretching endlessly before us. The sky had gone completely dark, and the only light came from my headlights cutting through the empty road ahead. I glanced at the dashboard clock. It was nearing midnight. Suddenly he spoke again. "There's something up ahead." I frowned, squinting at the road. "What do you mean?" I don't see. Before I could finish, the truck's headlights illuminated something in the distance. At first, it looked like an animal, a large shape moving across the road. But as we got closer, I realized it wasn't an animal at all. It was a man. He was crawling, his hands clawing at the asphalt as if he was dragging himself across the road. His clothes were torn, his face hidden in shadow. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop just a few feet from him. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to process what I was seeing. "Is he hurt?" I muttered, more to myself than to my passenger. Without warning, the man in the road lifted his head, and my blood ran cold. His eyes were wide and lifeless, his face twisted in a grotesque grin. It was as if he was staring directly at me, even though there was no way he could see through the windshield. I turned to my passenger, but the seat was empty. Panic surged through me as I looked around the cab. He was gone. No door had opened. No sound of him leaving. He had just vanished. My hand shook as I threw the truck into gear and floored it, swerving around the man in the road. As I sped past, I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see him crawling after me. But there was nothing. Just the empty road stretching behind me. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station on the outskirts of Amarillo. My hands were trembling as I stumbled out of the truck, gasping for air. I didn't sleep that night. To this day, I don't know who or what that passenger was. All I know is that I'll never pick up another hitchhiker again.